As we had discussed before, last week, we're going to be talking about the historical trauma, particularly since so many of our patients that we're reviewing come from a Native American background, and how important it can be to take that factor into account when it comes to working with them, particularly with regards to their trauma. So, yep, there we go. So cultural competence. I have a love-hate relationship with cultural competence. And I think I mentioned this last time, just because someone is white doesn't mean that they haven't had prejudice or discrimination or repression. We don't want to just assume by skin color that a person has or hasn't been traumatized or repressed. We do need to recognize that certainly minority cultures are more susceptible, and certainly there's a higher incidence, but I don't like the idea that just based on skin color or race that we determine that a person has or has not suffered some cultural trauma. But essentially, for us, the cultural competence means being aware of, particularly with the different populations that we work with, what does body language mean for them? What is their worldview? What values matter to them? Certain cultures, they view men and women differently, and so we might need to say, how do I interact with that family if maybe it's disrespectful to speak to the male? Maybe I need to talk through the female person and communicate that way. So just things like that to keep in our head. Same with communication. That goes right along with the eye contact. Certain indigenous cultures, eye contact is not respectful. It's actually seen as disrespect. And of course, in the quote unquote white culture, eye contact is how we show respect. And so if I'm doing something I think is respectful and it's not received that way, I need to be aware of it. Food and gifts are often a sign of respect. And so, we certainly as addiction counselors, at least, and I know for other professionals, you're not supposed to accept gifts. But yet, if someone gives me a gift or some type of token, and I say, no, I'm sorry, I can't take that, I'm showing disrespect. And so there has to be, there's some gray area with that. And being aware, too, that many social and health problems are seen as spiritually based for a lot of different cultures. There's actually a book that's really good. It's called The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. But it's about a Hmong family and how one of their children, the daughter, a small child, has epilepsy. And for their culture, it means the spirit catches her, and that's why she falls down. So she's actually seen as a spiritual and blessed being. But of course, the medical community didn't see it that way. And so what happened with that family when, there was a language barrier and the parents didn't understand what was being said and what the importance of the medication was. And then also, so therefore they were not compliant, and what happened with their family and child protective services. And really it was this cultural issue where their perception of what was wrong with their daughter was very different than the medical view. And so taking all those things into account. And it's not letting me take, there we go. Communication. So particularly for Native American cultures, storytelling is often a way to communicate. And I know it's interesting, some of the Native American people that I've worked with, I know I have to check myself because I get frustrated. I might ask a question, a very simple question like, well, tell me about what you did this weekend. And it goes into a 10-minute story. And I'm like, I just wanted to know what you did this weekend. When really, them telling me a lengthy story is how they're telling me about their weekend. And so we have to take things like that into consideration. And being aware, too, of how many of our Native American clients, some of them are very much rooted in that culture and others are not. And so for some of them, they might be more westernized or more quote unquote white in their perspective. But being aware that if they truly come from where their culture is very ingrained in them and it's how they do things, storytelling might be how they communicate with us. And we have to accept that that's how they're doing it. Karma is often in play in a lot of different cultures. And I know that many, when I use the term white culture, karma isn't necessarily there. We're more, white people tend to be more scientific and not as into the spiritual realm. Direct criticism is considered unacceptable, disrespectful, and disloyal. So how do we address that when maybe in going on inside the family, how do we provide feedback to them? Do they consider that criticism? Is it a sign of disrespect? How do we provide that feedback? Because providing feedback is a huge part of being a counselor. And so how do I provide that feedback to them? And so just my example here, how would this affect a child that's asked to speak out about abusive parents? Whereas maybe that's culturally something that the child is not allowed to do. And yet we're requiring the child to say what might be going on inside their family. And it may not be something that is culturally acceptable for them. We might be asking a child to go against very ingrained values and beliefs that have been instilled in them. Okay. Cultural competency, identity. Being aware that each individual will have their own unique experiences and spiritual beliefs. I had a client one time who was Crow, and I'd worked with her for a period of time, and she was going through a lot of grief. She experienced several deaths very close together. And so it really opened up this conversation, and I felt kind of silly, but I was saying, so tell me what you believe. Like, do you believe in a heaven? Do you believe in something different? Because knowing that for grief work, that's an important thing for me to know. I need to know, is God or a spirit a big part of what they believe happens to people after they die? And so she really shared with me her own very unique experience where she believed both. She believed that there was a heaven, but she also believed that there was a place over the mountain, and that's what she called it, where people go when they die. And so she really had both of those belief systems. And so really working with her about, you know, how do we process through the grief when she has a perspective that's very different from anything that I knew. And they sometimes, this one individual in particular, she often said she felt like she was walking in two worlds. She'd grown up mostly on the res, but she'd also gone to middle school and high school here in Billings. And so she had very much two different significant cultural perspectives, and how torn she sometimes felt, where she couldn't talk about some of her native practices with her white friends, and yet when she talked with her family about some of her white friends, then she was seen as almost betraying them. And so that was very difficult for her to feel stuck in between these two different worlds that were very important to her. This is another patient where she had multiple cultural customs just regarding the death. She believed two different things happen when a person dies, and so she had multiple cultural customs. And that's why it's really important when working with someone of Native American or other ethnicity, we really ask what is specific to them. What do they believe that this means? What is their perspective? Knowing that, you know, we could take lots of different classes on this is what this person or this population believes, knowing that it still might be different. It still might be very individualized. And often for Native Americans, organized religion, Christianity, is merged with their traditional beliefs and practices. And so they don't necessarily just have one perspective. And it's very important that we respect that and that we try to understand it. I tell patients, you know, you teach me about what you believe, because I don't know. And I really need them to be able to let me know what they believe and what they feel. So many Alaskan Indians and Native Americans, their beliefs are more holistic in terms of health or wellness. And so this is a medicine wheel. A lot of them believe more in that perspective than we talk about this more linear Western medicine perspective. They believe there's different influences from these different elements. And so really asking them where they fall with that. I know at Rimrock, we actually have recovery journals that have the medicine wheel and that use a lot of those Native American beliefs and perspectives in it. Because, you know, if you just give them like an AA big book, well, if they can't relate to that, then I'm not helping them in their recovery at all. And so I really need to be able to give them a perspective or tools that matches what they believe. And cultural competence, so more on the communication. Nonverbal communication is key. Gestures are important. And like I say, eye contact is often disrespectful. And so they may not look at you when they're talking to you. And if we're not aware that what that symbolizes to them, we may see it as they're being disengaged or they're being disrespectful or not being honest. Because in white culture, we see that as someone not being fully honest or being respectful. And it's really not that. Difficult messages are often shared through humor. Again, it's kind of one of those when I've asked some of my Native American clients to tell me about something that's happened to them. And they give me this really long story, and there's often different jokes and different tangents in it. And I really have to focus on what are they telling me, because inside my head, I'm like, come on, get to the point. And that's not helpful. I need to be aware that they are communicating with me in a different way, and I have to be able to adapt to that. Laughter is often medicine. I have a Native American colleague who he tells the most not inappropriate, but just the funniest jokes. And that's really how he communicates. You start a conversation with him and he tells you a joke to start it off. And that's just how he connects and how he relates to people. It's also important to be aware that for many Native Americans, direct questioning can be seen as attacking. And when you think about when you first meet with a client, we ask a lot of really direct questions. I often make a joke that I get paid to ask nosy questions that would otherwise be none of my business, because we ask questions that, in a different context would be really inappropriate. And so being aware that direct questioning, tell me about your childhood, tell me about your mom, tell me about your dad, when did you start using? Those types of questions can really be seen as confrontational. And so being aware of how we say that to them and telling them, I'm going to ask you some questions and I certainly don't want you to be offended by them, and let me know if I need to slow down. And then listen and observe more than you talk. Body language is a significant part of their communication. And I think, and I say again, white culture, that just sounds weird, but we often rely on words and verbiage instead of those nonverbal cues. So being aware of that when you're communicating with them. It's okay to admit that you don't know about their culture, and I have found that that has been my best tool when I meet a new patient that is Native American or any other minority status, when I say, tell me about your culture. Help me understand that. And I will say, I don't know, and I would love it if you would teach me. They really appreciate that when I'm very upfront with them that I don't know everything. If you visit in their house, not necessarily something that I would do in my position where I work, but in other fields, if you're, especially if you're a social worker that does house calls or things like that, and if you visit their house and you're offered food or drink, it's very disrespectful to not accept it. It's something that it's just, you just don't do it, you accept it. And again, that might be a conflict with some of our ethical practices that say you don't accept gifts from from patients. And in this case, it might be very inappropriate to not accept it. Explain what you're documenting in terms of, when we document things. I know for some of my clients, I typically do my notes. We have an EHR system. I typically do my notes during the session, but I do have some patients that I don't, because it would be distracting and it would be off-putting to them. Whereas a lot of my clients, I tell them, I'm doing your note as we talk. You're free to take a look at it if you need to, and they're fine with it. But some of my Native American clients, I don't document while we talk. It wouldn't be appropriate. And listening equals silence, whereas silence is difficult, especially when you talk about counseling training. We are taught if you are silent, the other person may jump in and try to fill the silence, because silence typically makes us feel uncomfortable. Whereas for a lot of Native Americans, silence is very comfortable because it's a respectful sign of I'm listening and focusing on you. And so silence has a different purpose with them. And Crow tribes, so this is often, most of our patients tend to be Crow. We do see Sioux and Cheyenne as well, but definitely Crow is the predominant Native American population in Billings. You can kind of see there on the map where the different tribes are, and based on your geographic location, that might dictate where they are from, and knowing that each tribe has its own nuances. But with the Native Americans, often when you say, where are you from? They talk about the family, not necessarily the specific geographic location. So they say their culture travels with them. It's not necessarily something that's dictated by land. And if we remember from last week, so many of the Native Americans moved around a lot. And so truly their culture is in the person, not necessarily tied to the land. There is definitely that land connection, but definitely it's the tribal name, it's the family name that carries their quote unquote location and their identity. The Crow tribe is one of the, like I said, one of the bigger tribes. Approximately 10,000 live on the reservation. And for many of them, they're not necessarily taught moderation. It's either they are completely abstinent or they are alcoholics. And so when you talk about that, being aware that that might be a perspective that they have as well. And I think that might be the last one. Yep, that's the last one. So just a little bit more on the cultural perspective for some of our folks. And I would really, everybody else's experiences. I think it's good when we learn from each other and talk about it. And I sometimes still feel like And even for myself, cultural competence is not something people don't want to talk about it because they don't want to offend anybody. And we really have to be willing to say, I don't know, please tell me your perspective. That's the only way we're going to improve. So I will turn it back over to Dr. McMillan for any discussion or questions.
Awesome, great presentation again today, Malcolm. I agree with you. That book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, it's amazing. That was one of my favorite books I read in all of college. So if you guys haven't heard that or read that book, I think it's definitely something to consider checking out. It's super interesting and I think pretty well written. So yeah, another great talk. Any other thoughts or comments about the presentation or questions for Malcolm?
I don't know if you do the same. This is Megan from MSP. I don't know if you do the same kind of assessments, but I've been sort of, I guess, struggling with just the basic mental status examination, like eye contact. Is it poor, avoidant, or appropriate? And how you answer that question, I guess, when we are looking at different cultures where the eye contact is not necessarily significant of a mental disorder, but it's just not culturally appropriate for them. And I'm kind of wondering how you phrase that or how you handle that.
So if I have a patient that isn't making eye contact with me, at least during my first 1 or 2 sessions, I don't make eye contact back. I take their lead, and if they're not making eye contact with me, then I don't engage trying to make eye contact. I follow their lead. After a couple of sessions, typically what I have found is, for the most part, after they get to know me a little bit, they look at me more. I know one person I had in particular, I think the first 2 sessions, I don't even know if he knew what I looked like. I mean, he looked at the floor the entire time. And so then after all, he'd kind of look up at me every once in a while. I would just make sure that I was looking at him when he looked at me. And after we had a little bit more rapport, and it's very natural to try to make eye contact. That's just, part of the way I was raised, that you make eye contact. And so after a couple sessions, he felt a little more comfortable with me, and I could say things like, I think I may have even said, hey, I just wanted you to know, if I make eye contact, it's just something that I'm used to doing, and I want you to feel safe. And I depend on you to tell me how I can help you feel safe. And that means a lot when you can say, you tell me how I help you. That's been a great tool for me when I can just be very open with them. So I just follow their lead. And often what I find is after a while, they are more willing to engage in eye contact. And I don't think I've had any that have continued to not maintain eye contact, like continuously. Like at first they might not, but then they start to. I'm trying to think. So I just follow their lead. And then I tell them, how do I help you feel safe and respected? I'm just pretty open about that. I don't know if that's helpful or not, Megan.
Yes, thank you.
I think the other thing, I don't know if maybe you were asking, but one thing I try to just document it, like in my mental status exam too, sometimes they'll say, kind of reduced eye contact or, limited eye contact, but maybe culturally appropriate, or, you could just write that right in your assessment if you're unsure, and you don't want to misdocument, sort of an issue. I don't know if that's kind of what you were asking, but sometimes I'll just say right in there, sort of, oh, limited eye contact, but, seems normal or baseline, or, based on cultural, issues may be appropriate for the patient, or, so it's sort of indicating that you don't think it's resulting in like a mental health symptom or, a result of a disorder, if that makes sense.
And like on our assessment, we actually have a section that says cultural notes or something like that, where we would put in, Native American didn't make eye contact, so I don't know if you guys have a place on like a form that you put that in, but I know we have one like on our assessment part that says specifically for that, where we're supposed to address that issue.
One
Okay,
thing,
yeah, thank you.
oh, go ahead.